The shelter on Varick's Crossing was always the loudest on choosing day. Families arrived before the morning bell, crowding into the front hall with warm voices and excited energy. The hatchlings inside could hear them coming, the sound of clawed feet on the metal floor, the low rumble of adult Drakari conversation, the occasional excited hiss from a younger sibling dragged along to watch. The hatchlings would press against the inner gate, eyes wide, tails flicking, each one telling themselves quietly that today would be their day. Each one except Scylla. While the others gathered at the gate, Scylla stayed in the corner of the common room. She had found a spot between the old warming shelf and the wall where she could sit without being in anyone's way. She pulled her knees up to her chest, folded her damaged left wing as tightly against her back as she could, and waited for the noise to be over. She was small for her age. Smaller than all the other hatchlings in the shelter, and most of them were younger than her. Her scales were a pale silver color that some of the adults called pretty, but pretty, she had learned, was not the same as chosen. Her left wing had been damaged before she was even old enough to remember how. The joint sat wrong, the membrane did not spread fully, and when she tried to extend it all the way it trembled and folded back in on itself like a piece of paper that had been creased too many times. 3 choosing days had come and gone. 3 times she had watched the room empty around her. She was not going to stand at the gate today. She already knew how this one was going to end. The shelter worker, a kind older Drakari female named Ara, moved through the common room with quiet efficiency, helping hatchlings straighten their neck frills and reminding them to stand tall. She had warm brown scales and patient eyes, and she was genuinely good at her job. When she passed Scylla's corner, she paused and looked down at her. "You could come to the gate," Ara said gently. "It is better if they can see you." Scylla looked up at her. "They saw me last time," she said. "And the time before." Ara did not have an answer for that. She put one warm hand briefly on top of Scylla's head, and then she moved on. The gate opened. The families came in. Scylla watched from her corner without meaning to. She had told herself she would look at the floor, but her eyes kept moving up on their own, pulled by some stubborn piece of hope that she had not quite managed to crush yet. She watched the first family move through the room, a large male and female Drakari with 2 grown children behind them, all of them well-dressed and confident. They walked slowly, looking at each hatchling carefully. The male stopped in front of a young green-scaled hatchling near the window. He crouched down. He smiled. The hatchling's whole body went stiff with excitement and then soft with relief all at once. Scylla looked at the floor. She heard footsteps. She looked up again without meaning to. A female from the second family was walking in her direction. Scylla sat up a little straighter without thinking about it. Her heart moved in her chest. The female had kind eyes and she was looking across the room, and then her gaze moved past Scylla and settled on the hatchling sitting 2 feet to Scylla's left, a small orange-scaled female with perfect wings and a bright expression. Scylla looked at the floor again. That was how it went for the next hour. Families moved through the room. Eyes moved over her and then past her. No one was unkind. No one said anything cruel. No one pointed at her wing or made a face. They simply looked at her the way people look at something they have already decided is not what they are looking for and moved on. It was worse than cruelty in some ways. Cruelty would have at least meant that they had really seen her. The room got quieter. Hatchlings left one by one, each departure a small cheerful event, a little knot of new family heading toward the front doors with happy sounds trailing behind them. The common room got bigger as it emptied. The space that each departing hatchling left behind felt enormous. By the end of the hour, Scylla was the only hatchling left. She sat in her corner and looked at the room. The warming shelf hummed softly beside her. Outside the main window, the lights of the station drifted past in slow patterns. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear the distant happy sounds of families leaving with their chosen children. Ara came back and sat beside her. She did not offer empty words. She had learned over 3 choosing days that Scylla did not want that. She just sat there close enough that her warmth reached Scylla's side, and she let the silence be what it was. Scylla stared at the floor. She thought about the green-scaled hatchling by the window, the way his whole body had changed the moment that family chose him. She thought about the orange-scaled female 2 feet to her left, now somewhere in the station with a new mother and father. She thought about the sound the gate made when it closed after the last family walked out. She pressed her small claws together in her lap. The thing she was feeling was not exactly sadness. It was heavier than sadness and quieter. It was the feeling of something becoming true that you had been hoping was not true. It was the feeling of a door closing, not with a slam but slowly, gently, until the latch clicks and the sound of it echoes in an empty room. She opened her mouth and the words came out before she decided to say them. Nobody wants me. She did not say it to Ara. She did not say it to herself exactly. She said it the way you say something when you are finally just admitting it to the air around you because carrying it silently has become too heavy and you have to put it somewhere. It was barely a whisper. It was the quietest sound in a quiet room. Out in the corridor, a human woman stopped walking. Nell Breyer was 34 years old. She had a tool bag over one shoulder, a work order on her data screen for a broken coolant pipe 3 levels below, and grease on her left hand from a job she had finished an hour ago. She had been walking quickly, the way she always walked when she had somewhere to be, and she had been passing the shelter door because the shelter was on the route to the service elevator. The door was half open. She had not been looking at it, but she had heard the whisper. She stopped. She stood in the corridor with her tool bag on her shoulder and her data screen in her hand, and she did not move for a moment. The words she had heard were so small, so flat. Not a cry, not a sob, just a small quiet voice stating a fact that it had clearly been sitting with for a long time. Nell turned and looked through the observation window beside the door. She saw the common room. She saw how empty it was. She saw the older shelter worker sitting quietly to one side. And she saw the small silver-scaled hatchling in the corner, alone in the middle of all that empty space, with her knees pulled up and her damaged wing folded tight and her eyes on the floor. Nell stood there for a few seconds. She thought about the coolant pipe 3 levels down. She thought about her work order and the afternoon schedule and the fact that she had 2 more jobs after this one and it was already past midday. Then she set her tool bag down against the wall of the corridor, very carefully and deliberately, like someone who has made a decision and is now acting on it. She knocked lightly on the door frame and looked at the shelter worker inside. "Is it all right if I come in?" she asked. Her voice was calm and easy, the way she spoke when she did not want to make anything feel like a big moment. "Just to sit for a minute?" Ara looked at her with quiet surprise. Humans passed through Varick's Crossing all the time. None of them had ever knocked on this door before. She studied the human woman's face for a moment. There was nothing in it that worried her. There was just a kind of steadiness, the look of someone who had heard something they could not unhear and was now doing what seemed like the only reasonable thing to do about it. Ara stepped aside. Nell walked in. Nell did not go straight to the hatchling. That was the first thing Ara noticed. Most visitors, when they entered the common room and saw a child sitting alone, would walk directly toward them with a big smile and a loud cheerful voice, as if enthusiasm alone could fix the problem. Nell did none of that. She came through the door, looked around the room once, and then chose a spot on the floor roughly in the middle of the space, not close to Scylla, not far either, and sat down cross-legged like she had simply decided that the floor was a perfectly reasonable place to be. She set her tool bag beside her and opened the front pocket without any hurry. Ara watched from near the doorway. She did not leave. She stayed quiet and kept her distance, curious in a way she could not quite explain. Scylla had not moved. She was still in her corner with her knees up and her eyes low. But Ara could see that the hatchling was watching the human woman from the edge of her vision, that careful sideways attention that small creatures use when they want to see something without admitting they are looking. Nell pulled something out of the front pocket of her tool bag and turned it over in her hands. It was a small bird. Mechanical, made of copper-colored metal, with 2 folded wings and a narrow body no bigger than Nell's fist. One of the tail pieces was cracked and sitting at a wrong angle. One of the wing joints had a visible bend in it that did not look intentional. It was clearly broken. It was also clearly something that had once been and could perhaps be again, a very fine little thing. Nell turned it over slowly, looking at it the way she looked at everything she was working on, with calm attention, no frustration, just honest assessment. She did not look at Scylla. She did not say anything for a little while. The silence in the room was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that has something happening inside it. Scylla's sideways attention shifted by degrees. Her chin lifted slightly. Her eyes moved from the floor to the object in the human's hands. After a while Nell spoke. She did not raise her voice and she did not direct the words at anyone in particular. She spoke the way someone speaks when they are just thinking out loud. "Picked this up at a parts stall near the East Dock," she said. "Seller had it in a box with a bunch of other stuff he was getting rid of. Said it was junk." She tilted the little bird and looked at the cracked tail piece. "Said it wasn't worth anything because it didn't work anymore." She turned it the other way. "I think he was wrong," she said simply. There was a pause. Then a small voice came from the corner. "Does it fly?" Nell looked up as if she had only just noticed Scylla was there. She kept her expression easy and calm, nothing too big, nothing that would make the moment feel fragile. "Not right now," she said. "The left wing joint is bent and the tail balance is off. But those are both fixable problems." She held the bird up slightly so the light caught the copper metal. It just needs someone with enough patience to work through it. Scylla was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, she uncurled from her corner. Not all the way, she did not come across the room yet. She just straightened up a little and rested her arms on her knees, and her eyes stayed on the little bird. "How do you fix a bent joint?" she asked. Nell turned the bird over again and pointed at the damaged wing with one finger. "You have to understand why it bent first," she said. "If you just push it back without understanding the reason, it will bend again. So you look at the angle, you look at where the stress came from, and then you work slowly in the right direction." She paused. "You never force it. You guide it." Scylla stared at the bird for another long moment. Then she got up and crossed the room and sat down on the floor a short distance from Nell, close enough to see properly, far enough to feel safe. She folded her legs underneath her and looked at the mechanical bird with serious, careful eyes. Nell held it out without a word. Scylla took it. Her small claws wrapped around it gently, and she turned it over the same way Nell had, slow and thoughtful. She felt the weight of it, looked at the cracked tail, pressed one careful claw tip against the bent wing joint. "It is heavier than it looks," she said. "Good materials," said Nell. "Whoever made it originally knew what they were doing. That is another reason it is worth fixing. Some things are made well enough that they deserve a second chance." Scylla turned the bird over again. She did not say anything for a moment, but something in her face had changed. The flat, closed-off expression she had been wearing all day had shifted into something more awake. Her eyes were moving over the little object with genuine interest. "What is your name?" Nell asked. "Scylla. I am Nell." She said it without ceremony, just one person telling another their name. "I fix ships mostly. Engines, hull joints, pressure systems. Whatever is broken." Scylla looked up at her. "Big things," she said. "Usually," said Nell. "But the principles are the same whether something is big or small. You look at it carefully. You figure out what it needs. You do not give up on it just because it is going to take time." Scylla looked back down at the bird. Her thumb, the flat part of her claw where the scale was smooth, moved slowly along the edge of the damaged wing. "Does everything broken get fixed?" she asked. Her voice was careful. It was not really a question about the bird. Nell heard what was underneath it. She did not pretend otherwise, but she also did not make a large moment out of it. She just answered honestly. "Not always," she said. "Sometimes the damage is too deep or nobody gets to it in time. But a lot of the time, the thing that stops something from being fixed is not the damage itself." She rested her arm on her knee and looked at Scylla steadily. "It is just that nobody took the time." The common room was very quiet. Scylla held the little copper bird in her hands and looked at it for a long time. Outside the main window, the station lights drifted past in their slow patterns, and the hum of the shelter's heating system was low and constant and warm. After a while Scylla asked how the wing mechanism worked. Nell explained it, the hinge design, the way the two pieces were meant to sit together, the small pin that had probably snapped and caused the joint to lose its alignment. Scylla asked 3 more questions. Nell answered all of them in full, without shortening anything or talking down to her, treating each question like it deserved a real answer because it did. They sat together on the floor of the empty common room for a long time. Ara had stopped watching from the doorway at some point and gone to do other work. When she came back near the end of the afternoon she found them still there, the mechanical bird sitting on the floor between them while Scylla talked about the station maintenance tunnels she had seen from the shelter window, and Nell listened with complete attention. When the shelter's evening bell rang and Nell finally stood up to go, she looked down at Scylla and asked one last question. "What do you want to do someday? If you could do anything at all?" Scylla looked at her damaged wing. She was quiet for a moment in the way that means a person is deciding whether to say the true thing or the safe thing. She said the true thing. "I want to fly," she said quietly. "Properly. Not just gliding or short hops. Really fly." She paused. "Everyone says my wing will never be right enough for that." Nell looked at her for a moment. Her expression was steady and serious and it did not contain a single drop of pity, only the same calm, honest attention she gave to everything she was trying to understand. "I will see you tomorrow," she said. Then she picked up her tool bag and walked out. Scylla stood in the middle of the common room and watched the door for a while after Nell had gone. She was not sure what she was feeling exactly. It was careful and small and she did not want to name it yet in case naming it made it disappear. But it was there. For the first time in a very long time, it was there. Ara came by and saw the look on Scylla's face, the faintest, most cautious beginning of a smile, and she said nothing at all. She simply put a warm hand on the hatchling's head for a moment and then moved on quietly, leaving the feeling exactly where it was. Nell did not sleep much that night. She sat at her small desk in her quarters with a cup of tea that went cold before she drank half of it, and she read. She had pulled up every document she could find on the Galactic Welfare and Hatchling Protection Bureau, their rules, their forms, their requirements, their history. She read guardianship guidelines that had clearly been written with Drakari families in mind, because no one had ever imagined writing them for anyone else. She read cross-species welfare codes that were vague in some places and very specific in others. She read a footnote in a legal document from 11 years ago that said, in dry official language, that cross-species guardianship applications were technically permitted under Galactic Welfare Code Section 7, Clause 4, but that no such application had ever been filed for a Drakari hatchling by a human guardian. Not once. Not ever. Nell read that footnote twice. Then she opened a blank form and she started filling it in. She arrived at the bureau office on level 6 at 10 minutes before it opened. She was the first person in the door. The clerk at the front desk was a young Drakari male who had clearly not yet finished waking up, and he looked at Nell with the mild, unfocused expression of someone expecting a routine morning. She slid the completed application across the counter. He looked at it. He read the first section. Then he read it again more slowly, and his expression changed from unfocused to confused in a way that was almost interesting to watch. He looked up at Nell. "You are applying for guardianship," he said carefully, "of a Drakari hatchling." "Permanent guardianship," Nell said pleasantly. "Though I understand the process begins with a trial period. 90 days according to the welfare code." The clerk looked back at the form. Then he picked it up and walked through the door behind him without another word. Nell sat down in one of the waiting chairs and folded her hands in her lap. She waited for 20 minutes. During that time, 3 different bureau staff members came to the front window and looked at her with varying degrees of confusion. She smiled at each of them. None of them smiled back, but one of them nodded, which she counted as progress. Eventually the clerk came back and told her that Elder Soreth would see her. The office she was led to was large and orderly, with high shelves full of bound record files and a wide desk that had clearly been chosen to communicate authority. Behind the desk sat a Drakari elder with deep gray scales, steady eyes, and the careful posture of someone who had spent 40 years making important decisions and knew exactly how much weight they carried. Elder Soreth looked at Nell's application on the desk in front of him. Then he looked at Nell. He was not unkind. That was the first thing she noticed. He did not look at her with contempt or amusement. He looked at her the way a person looks at something genuinely unexpected, with serious attention and no clear category to put it in yet. He folded his hands on the desk and began to speak. He told her that Drakari hatchlings had specific developmental needs that were deeply tied to their biology and culture. Fire-breathing discipline began in early youth and required careful guidance from an experienced adult. Misdirected flame instinct in a young hatchling could be dangerous to everyone around them. Wing development required structured daily exercise and correct physical support during the growth period. Drakari honor tradition was not simply a set of rules but a living framework that shaped how a young Drakari understood themselves and their place in the world. A hatchling raised without that foundation would struggle in Drakari society for the rest of their life. He spoke clearly and thoroughly, and every point he made was real. He was not inventing problems to be difficult. He genuinely believed what he was saying. Nell listened to all of it without interrupting once. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Nell leaned forward slightly in her chair and spoke in the same calm, even tone she had been using all morning. "You are right," she said. "About everything you just described." Elder Soreth had clearly been expecting some form of argument. The agreement caught him off balance by a small but visible amount. "I cannot teach her fire discipline from personal experience," Nell continued. "I cannot fly, so I cannot guide her wing development from the air. I was not raised in Drakari tradition and I will not pretend that I understand all of it." She paused for just a moment. "But I want to be honest with you about what I can do because I think it matters." She looked at him directly. "I can make sure she is never passed over again," she said. "I can make sure she wakes up every morning knowing that someone chose her, not because she was the easiest option but because she was specifically, deliberately chosen. I can learn what she needs. I can find the right people to teach her what I cannot teach her myself. I can show up every single day without fail." She kept her voice steady and clear. "What I am offering Scylla is not a replacement for Drakari culture. It is a person who will not walk away from her. And right now in that shelter she does not have that." The room was very quiet. Elder Soreth looked at her for a long time. His expression had not softened exactly, but it had shifted into something more careful and more thoughtful than it had been at the start of the conversation. Neither of them had noticed that the office door was not fully closed. Out in the corridor, a Drakari merchant who had been waiting for an unrelated appointment had gone completely still against the wall. He was a broad, well-dressed male with gold-edged scale markings, and he had stopped moving at some point during Nell's words and had not started again. Elder Soreth looked down at the application on his desk. He was quiet for long enough that the silence had weight. Then he looked up. "I am not able to approve permanent guardianship at this stage," he said. "What I am able to authorize is a 90-day trial period, as outlined under Welfare Code Section 7. You will be assessed at regular intervals. Sila's well-being will be monitored directly. If the assessment at the end of the trial period does not meet the required standard, she returns to the shelter." He held her gaze. "If you agree to those terms," he said, "I will sign the authorization today." Nell did not hesitate for even a second. "I agree," she said. She signed the documents. Elder Soreth signed the authorization. The clerk made copies with the slightly dazed efficiency of someone who was processing an event they would be telling people about for years. Nell thanked Elder Soreth, picked up her copy of the paperwork and walked out. She did not go back to her quarters. She did not stop for food even though she had not eaten since the previous evening. She walked straight to the service corridor that led to the lower decks, took the elevator down and went directly to the shelter. Ara was at the front desk when she arrived and looked up with mild surprise. "She is in the common room," Ara said before Nell had said anything at all. Nell nodded and went through. Sila was sitting in her usual corner, but she was not curled up the way she had been yesterday. She was sitting upright, and she had the little copper bird in her hands. Nell had left it with her the evening before without making anything of it, and she was looking at the bent wing joint with focused eyes, as if she had been thinking about it since last night. She looked up when Nell came in. She did not smile, but her eyes were alert and her posture changed in that small way that means a person is more awake than they were a moment ago. Nell crossed the room and crouched down to Sila's level. She looked at her directly, the same way she always did, without softening it into something easier. "I have something to tell you," she said. "I want you to hear all of it before you say anything." Sila set the copper bird down carefully and gave Nell her full attention. Nell told her about the bureau application. She explained the trial period plainly and honestly, 90 days, regular assessments, no guarantees yet. She did not dress it up or make it sound more certain than it was, because Sila had been disappointed before and she was not going to hand her false certainty. She told her what she had said to Elder Soreth. She told her what she had promised. Sila listened to every word without moving. Her face was still and careful in the way that meant she was working very hard to stay in control of what she was feeling, because she did not yet trust the feeling enough to let it out. When Nell finished, the room was quiet. Sila looked at her for a long moment with those careful, serious eyes. Then something shifted. Something behind the stillness gave way, not all at once but in one long slow exhale, like a wall that had been holding back water for a very long time finally letting it through. She leaned forward. Nell opened her arms. Sila leaned into them slowly at first and then all at once, and she held on with both small clawed hands and pressed her face against Nell's shoulder and did not say a single word. Nell held her steadily and did not say anything either. She did not need to. Everything that mattered had already been said. The first thing Nell did when she got back to her quarters that evening was stand in the middle of the room and look at it honestly. It was a standard station mechanic's quarters. One main room, a small washroom, a sleeping area separated by a half wall, and a narrow window that looked out at the inner dock. It was tidy because Nell was a tidy person, but it was built for one and everything in it said so. The single chair at the desk. The one hooked by the door. The shelves organized entirely around her own tools and her own books and her own small collection of engine components she kept for reference. She looked at all of it and started rearranging. She moved the desk to the left side of the room to open up the right corner near the window. She dismantled the extra storage shelf she had been using as a catch-all and rebuilt it lower and wider, adding a top perch using a flat panel of hull-grade composite she had in her work supplies. She lined the perch with the warmest material she could find at the station market that evening, a thick woven sheet used for insulating pipe joints that turned out to be, once folded several times over, surprisingly soft. She added 2 lower platforms leading up to the main perch so that climbing up and down was easy. She tested the whole structure herself, pressing on each level to check the weight tolerance, making sure nothing shifted or creaked. She finished at nearly midnight. She stood back and looked at the corner. It was not beautiful. It was built by a mechanic out of practical materials, and it looked like exactly that. But it was solid, and it was warm, and it was specifically made for someone, which was more than the corner had been before. She thought that Scylla might like it. Scylla arrived 2 days later, carrying nothing except the copper bird in her hands and a small cloth bundle of shelter belongings under one arm. She stood in the doorway of Nell's quarters for a moment and looked at the room with careful eyes. Then she saw the corner by the window. She walked over to it slowly. She looked at the perch and the lower platforms and the thick folded lining. She pressed one hand against the main perch to test it the same way Nell had, checking whether it held. It held perfectly. She climbed up to the top perch and sat on it and looked out the window at the dock. Ships moved slowly past in the middle distance. Station lights reflected off their hulls in long moving lines. She did not say anything for a little while. Then she said, "You built this?" "This morning," Nell said. "Well, 2 nights ago. I rebuilt part of it this morning because the second platform was sitting at the wrong angle." Scylla looked at her. "You rebuilt it?" "The angle was wrong," Nell said simply, as if this required no further explanation. Because to her it did not. Scylla turned back to the window. After a moment she said very quietly, "Nobody ever built me anything before." Nell did not make a big moment of it. She just said, "The angle on the second platform is right now. You can check it if you want." And she went to put the kettle on. The first week had difficult moments. Scylla woke twice from bad dreams and sat upright on her perch with her small chest heaving and her eyes wide and lost. Both times Nell was awake within seconds. She did not rush over or make loud comforting sounds. She just turned on the low desk light, sat on the edge of her sleeping area and said calmly, "I am here. You are in the quarters. You are safe." She said it the same way both times, steady and plain, until she could see Scylla's breathing slow down and her eyes come back from wherever they had been. On the 4th day, a pressure release valve 2 corridors away fired without warning, a routine mechanical event that was simply very loud, and Scylla scorched the wall above her perch with a short burst of panicked flame before she even knew she had done it. She stared at the black mark on the wall and looked at Nell with an expression that was part fright and part the specific shame of someone who has lost control in front of a person they want to trust them. Nell looked at the scorch mark. Then she went to her supply cabinet and got 2 cleaning cloths. She handed one to Scylla without a word and started cleaning her half of the wall. Scylla stared at the cloth in her hand for a second. Then she started cleaning too. When the mark was gone, Nell said, "When something loud happens without warning, it helps to count to 10 slowly before your body decides what to do. It gives your brain time to catch up." She paused. "It works for humans too. I scorched something once. Different way, no fire involved, but the principle was the same." Scylla looked at her. "What did you scorch?" "A very expensive pressure coupling," Nell said. "My supervisor was not pleased." Scylla made a sound that was almost a laugh. It was small and surprised, like it had come out before she decided to let it. Nell had been thinking about the wing since before Scylla moved in. She had spent 3 evenings reading everything she could find on Drakari wing anatomy, the joint structure, the membrane composition, the way the bones were arranged and how they bore weight during flight. She had looked at medical documentation on Scylla's specific injury, which Ara had forwarded to her with quiet efficiency. She had looked at it the way she looked at a damaged ship component. Mapping the problem, understanding the stress points, thinking about what kind of support would allow function without forcing anything that was not ready. She had sketched 6 different brace designs before she had one she thought was worth showing someone. The someone she brought it to was a Drakari physician named Dr. Fenn, who worked out of a small medical practice on level 4. He was younger than she had expected, with bright copper-green scales and the slightly distracted manner of someone whose mind was always working on 2 things at once. He had studied cross-species physiology as part of his training, which made him less likely to dismiss what she was about to show him. He looked at her sketches for a long time without speaking. "You are a ship mechanic," he said finally. "Yes," said Nell. "And you have designed a wing brace." "I have designed a load-bearing support structure with articulated joints and graduated flex resistance," Nell said. "The application is different. The principles are the same ones I use when I am reinforcing a damaged structural joint on a mid-range freight vessel." Dr. Fenn looked at the sketches again. He picked up one of them and tilted it, looking at the joint design from a different angle. He set it down. He picked up another one. "This flex point here," he said, pointing at the 3rd sketch. "You have it in the right place anatomically. Most non-Drakari who attempt wing support designs get that wrong. I spent a long time on the anatomy documentation before I drew anything," Nell said. Dr. Fenn looked at her with something that was not quite surprise but was close to it, the look of someone revising an assumption they had not known they were making. He said he would need 2 weeks to translate her mechanical design into something that met medical standards. He said he would need her input throughout the process because some of her engineering solutions were things he would not have thought of himself. He said the approach was unorthodox. Then he said he thought it might work. They shook hands and started the following morning. Nell had begun taking Scylla to the maintenance bay on level 3 from the first week. She had not asked anyone's permission. She had simply brought her along, introduced her to the other workers with the same easy calm she used for everything, and let things develop naturally. The workers were a mixed crew, humans, a few other species, all of them practical people who cared more about whether you were useful than about what you looked like. They were cautious with Scylla at first, not unkind but uncertain, the way people are when they are not sure what is expected of them. Scylla was cautious too. She stayed close to Nell for the first few days, watching everything with wide serious eyes and asking questions in a low voice, as if she was not sure whether questions were allowed. Nell always answered in full. Loudly enough that nearby workers could hear, which meant that within a few days several of them had started answering too when Scylla asked something near them. A hull welder named Greta Marsh started pointing things out before Scylla even asked, narrating her work in simple terms, clearly enjoying having an attentive audience. Scylla began directing questions at Greta directly, which made Greta visibly pleased. Walt Kress was the senior engineer, a large, broad-shouldered human with very little patience for inefficiency and a great deal of patience for anyone who was genuinely trying to learn. He had watched Scylla for about a week before he said anything to her directly. He was working on a conduit access panel in the lower bay, trying to reach a connector point that required getting into a space his hands were simply too large to fit comfortably. He had been at it for 20 minutes with limited success. He sat back on his heels and looked at the opening with the expression of a man negotiating with a problem. Then he looked at Scylla, who was watching nearby. "Your hands are smaller than mine," he said. It was not a question. It was the statement of a practical man identifying a practical solution. Scylla looked at him. Then at the opening. Then back at him. "What do I do?" she asked. Walt showed her. He described the connector, what it looked like, how it needed to be turned and at what angle. He talked her through it step by step while she reached into the space and found it by feel and did exactly what he said. The connector clicked into place. Walt sat back and looked at the panel reading, which now showed the correct pressure value. He nodded once with the deep satisfaction of a problem resolved. "Good hands," he said. Scylla pulled her arm back out of the access point and looked at her claws. Then she looked at Walt. There was something in her expression that had not been there before, a new kind of straight-backed, quiet confidence, the kind that does not come from being told you are good but from doing something real and having it work. Walt made her his unofficial second for all tight space checks from that day forward. He asked for her specifically when a job required it, by name, in the same tone he used when he asked for a specific tool, the tone of someone who has identified exactly what they need and knows where to find it. Elder Soreth came on the 19th day without any warning. Nell was showing Scylla how to read a pressure gauge calibration when she looked up and saw him standing in the entrance of the maintenance bay. He was in plain clothing, no official markings, and he was watching the bay floor with careful eyes. Nell met his gaze for a moment. He gave her a single slow nod. She returned it and went back to the gauge. She did not perform anything differently. She did not try to make the lesson look better than it was. She just kept going, talking Scylla through the calibration steps the same way she always did, answering the questions Scylla asked, waiting without impatience when Scylla worked through a step slowly. After about 20 minutes she looked up again and Elder Soreth was gone. He came back on the 43rd day. This time she did not see him at all until after the shift was over, when Walt mentioned in passing that someone had been watching from the upper walkway during the afternoon. She thought about what had been happening during the afternoon. She and Scylla had been underneath a decommissioned cargo hauler, Scylla narrating a problem she had found in the undercarriage connections while Nell passed her tools one at a time and asked follow-up questions. Both of them had been covered in mechanical dust. Scylla had been speaking with growing confidence about what she was seeing and why she thought it mattered. Nell had been listening with complete attention and asking questions that built on each other, the way a good teacher does without ever using that word for themselves. Both of them had been completely unbothered by the dust, the noise, or anything else. Nell thought about what Elder Soreth would have seen from the upper walkway. She hoped it had been enough. But even as she thought it, she realized that she had not been doing any of it to be seen. She had just been doing it because it was what the day required, the same as every other day. That, she thought, was probably the point. 13 days remained in the trial period when Dr. Fenn sent Nell a message asking her to come to his office alone. That word, alone, sat in Nell's chest in a way she did not fully like. She read the message twice, put her data screen down, and looked at the ceiling of her quarters for a moment. Scylla was on her perch by the window, working through a small mechanical puzzle that Walt had given her the day before, focused and quiet. She had not seen the message. Nell told her she had a quick errand to run on level 4 and that she would be back within the hour. She said it in the easy, unhurried tone she used when something was not worth worrying about. Scylla nodded without looking up from the puzzle and turned one of the pieces over in her claws with a small sound of concentration. Nell walked out and took the elevator up. She did not let herself think too much in the corridor outside Dr. Fenn's office. She had spent 83 days not letting herself want the specific thing too loudly, because wanting it loudly made the distance between where they were and where they needed to be feel enormous. She had put her energy into the days instead, into each morning, each shift, each small moment of progress, and she had kept the larger hope somewhere quiet and protected where it would not distract her. But 13 days was close. Close enough that the quiet place where she kept the hope was getting harder to manage. She knocked. Dr. Fenn opened the door. His expression was the careful kind. The kind a person wears when they have something significant to say and they want to say it correctly. Nell had learned to read Dr. Fenn's face over the past weeks of working together, and what she saw now was not bad news. It was something else, something held in with effort, the way you hold a door shut when there is pressure on the other side. She sat down across from his desk. He pulled up the latest scan results on his screen and turned it to face her. He walked her through the imaging data point by point the way he always did, carefully, thoroughly, giving her the full picture before the conclusion. She had always appreciated that about him. He did not skip to the end. He showed her the wing joint first. The brace had been doing exactly what it was designed to do, distributing the load correctly, preventing the kind of strain that had been keeping the joint from stabilizing. The joint had responded. The bone structure had realigned gradually over the weeks of supported movement, following the correct angle the way a bent piece of metal slowly returns toward true when the right pressure is applied consistently and gently over time. He showed her the muscle tissue readings next. New growth, measurable and clear, along the support lines of the wing. The tissue was building itself back in the pattern of a functional wing, not a damaged one. He showed her the membrane measurements last. 7 weeks ago the secondary membrane had shown almost no development. The current scan showed growth that neither of them had recorded before. He put the screen down and looked at her. She will not fly at full Drakari speed, he said. He said it carefully, the way someone does when they want to make sure the good news is understood clearly and not overclaimed. Her range will have limits compared to a fully developed adult. Long-distance high-altitude flight may always be difficult for her. He paused. But she will fly, he said. Properly. Under her own power. The wing will support it. Nell sat with that for a moment. She pressed her hand over her mouth and looked up at the ceiling and breathed slowly through her nose. She was not going to come apart in Dr. Fenn's office. She was a practical person and she had work still to do. She told herself both of these things firmly. Her eyes were bright anyway. Dr. Fenn, to his credit, looked at the desk and gave her a moment. The brace design, he said after a little while, his voice slightly more textured than usual, was the correct solution. I want to say that plainly. A medical approach alone would not have achieved this result in this time frame. Possibly not at all. He paused. You were right about the load-bearing principles. We were right, Nell said. Her voice was steady again. Dr. Fenn looked at her. Then he nodded, accepting that. Nell thanked him, got the full documentation printed for the bureau file, shook his hand and walked out into the corridor. She stood outside the closed office door for a moment with the printed documents in her hand and let herself feel it. Just for a moment, just standing still in the empty corridor, the full weight of what had just been said. Scylla would fly. After everything, after all the choosing days and all the passed-over mornings and all the adults who had looked at that damaged wing and quietly decided she was not worth the effort, she would fly. Nell closed her eyes briefly. Then she opened them and started walking toward the elevator. She did not know, as she walked away, that she had not been alone in the corridor. Scylla had finished the mechanical puzzle faster than expected. She had set it down on the perch, looked at the door for a moment, and decided that level 4 was not very far and that she knew the way to Dr. Fenn's office because she had been there 4 times already for brace adjustments. She had told herself she was just going to walk that direction. She had not told herself she was going to listen outside the door. But the door had not been fully closed, and she had arrived just as Dr. Fenn began showing Nell the scan results and she had stopped. She had heard everything. She was still standing in the corridor when Nell walked out, but Nell turned the other direction toward the elevator and did not see her. Scylla stood completely still against the wall with the printed exit of the office door 2 feet away from her and Dr. Fenn's words still moving through her like something she did not have a shape for yet. She will fly. Properly. Under her own power. Scylla had been told things about her wing her whole life. She had been told it was damaged. She had been told it was unlikely to develop correctly. She had been told, in the careful language adults use when they are trying to be kind about something permanent, that she should focus on what she could do rather than what she could not. She had carried all of those words for years. They had become part of the way she understood herself, settled into her bones the same way the cold certainty of the empty common room had settled in after the third choosing day. She had not stopped wanting to fly. She had just stopped believing it was something that could actually happen. And now someone had just said, with scanned data and clinical precision and complete seriousness, that it could. The wall she had been holding up came down. Not slowly. All at once. She slid down the corridor wall until she was sitting on the floor with her knees pulled up and her face pressed against them, and she cried in a way she had never cried before in her life, not the careful quiet tears she had learned to cry in the shelter so that nobody would feel uncomfortable, but big shaking sobs that came from somewhere so deep and so long held that they felt like they were made of years, not just this moment. She was not crying because she was sad. She had never cried from something like this before and she did not have a word for it. This enormous, overwhelming feeling of something you had given up on being handed back to you. She cried for a long time in the empty corridor. When Nell came back around the corner 2 minutes later, having reached the elevator, pressed the button, and then stood there for 5 seconds before turning around because something in her chest said go back, she found Scylla on the floor against the wall. She did not ask what happened. She did not say anything at all. She crossed the corridor and sat down on the floor beside her and put her arms around her and held on. Scylla grabbed hold and pressed her face against Nell's shoulder and cried the rest of it out, all of it, every year of it, while Nell sat steady on the cold corridor floor and did not move and did not rush her and did not say a single word until the shaking slowed and the sobs became quieter and the quiet became something softer. Then Nell said very gently, I was going to tell you properly. I had a whole plan. Scylla made a sound that was half sob and half laugh, muffled against Nell's shoulder. You were outside the door, Nell said. It was not an accusation. The puzzle was not very hard, Scylla said, her voice thick and small. Nell laughed, a real one, warm and relieved and slightly undone, and held her tighter. They sat on the floor of the level 4 corridor for a while longer, and neither of them worried about how it looked. The story by that point had been moving through Varick's Crossing for weeks. It had started in the maintenance bay, passed between workers over shared meals and shift changeovers, carried upward through the station the way stories do when they have something true at their center. By the time the corridor moment happened, most of the station knew the broad shape of it, the human mechanic, the unwanted hatchling, the wing brace built from ship repair thinking, the trial period that looked less like a formal assessment and more like a family quietly becoming real. Elder Soreth had heard it too. He had seen parts of it himself. And 13 days before the trial ended, he called a formal community gathering in the Drakari Assembly Hall on Level 8. Nell received the notification on her data screen and read it twice. Her first feeling was a familiar one, the careful, braced feeling of someone who has come a long way and is not yet certain the ground ahead is solid. She told Scylla about the gathering in the same honest, straightforward way she told her everything. Scylla's jaw tightened slightly. Is he going to say no? She asked. I do not know, Nell said. I am going to go and listen and find out. Scylla looked at her. I am coming with you. Nell considered this for exactly 1 second. Yes, she said. You are. The assembly hall was full. Drakari community members from across the station had come, elders, families, working adults, a few younger Drakari who stood near the back with curious expressions. They filled the tiered seating and the standing areas and the side corridors. Nell and Scylla walked in together and found 2 seats near the front that had been left open, which Nell thought was either deliberate or fortunate and chose to take as a good sign. Elder Soreth stood at the front of the hall. He waited for the room to settle, and when it did the silence was the particular kind that means everyone present understands that what comes next is significant. He spoke for several minutes. He spoke about tradition and about what Drakari culture required of those who raised its young, the responsibilities, the weight of them, the reason they had always been taken seriously. He did not rush through it. He gave it its full due. Scylla sat very still beside Nell. Nell sat with her hands folded and her expression calm, though her jaw was set. Then Elder Soreth paused. He looked at Nell directly across the full length of the hall, and when he spoke again his voice was different. Slower, carrying more weight than formal language usually carried. He said that in 4 decades of service to the Drakari community, He had encountered many people who argued well for a child's future. People who used the right words and cited the right codes and presented the right documents. He had met very few, he said, who had simply gotten up every morning for 83 days and built that future with their hands and their time and their consistent, unbroken presence. He said that he had been wrong to place the emphasis where he had placed it at the beginning. What a child needed most was not a guardian who could do everything correctly from birth. It was a guardian who would not stop. He withdrew his opposition. Formally, completely, and before everyone present. Then he looked at Nell and spoke a phrase in Old Drakari, 4 words, low and deliberate, each one carrying the weight of something much older than the station they were standing in. The translator near the door rendered it quietly into the common tongue. One who carries another's sky. The hall was silent for a moment. Then the bureau representative who had been sitting in the second row stood up and announced clearly that given the documented evidence of the trial period, the assessments on record, and the medical progress report filed that same afternoon by Dr. Fenn, the bureau was waiving the remaining 13 days. Permanent guardianship was approved, effective immediately. Nell sat very still for a second. Then she felt a small clawed hand press into hers. She looked down. Scylla was looking straight ahead at Elder Sorith, her silver scales bright under the hall lights, her repaired wing held carefully at her side, her expression carrying something that had not been there on the first choosing day, something open and certain and quietly unbreakable. Nell closed her hand around Scylla's and did not let go. On the walk home through the station corridors that evening, they did not talk much. They did not need to. The station moved around them the way it always did, ships in the dock, workers on the walkways, the low constant hum of a place that never fully slept. Scylla walked beside Nell with her chin up and her steps easy, and for the first time in her life she did not feel like someone who had been left behind. She felt like someone who was on her way home. 5 months is not a long time in the life of a station. Ships came and went. Contracts ended and new ones started. Workers transferred in and transferred out. The maintenance bay on level 3 cycled through its usual rhythm of broken things being fixed and fixed things breaking again, and the days moved the way days do when people are busy and purposeful and have somewhere to be each morning. But something had changed on Varick's Crossing in those 5 months. It had changed quietly, the way most real things change. Not with an announcement but with the slow accumulation of small moments that add up to something different from what was there before. People knew Scylla now. Not as a story, not as the hatchling the human mechanic had taken in, but as herself, as the silver-scaled girl who could find a fault in a conduit connection faster than anyone twice her size, who asked questions that made experienced engineers stop and think, who had a serious face and a rare laugh and hands that were, as Walt Kress had said on more than one occasion, the best diagnostic tool in the bay. She had stopped flinching at pressure alarms somewhere around the 2nd month. She had stopped checking where Nell was every few minutes somewhere around the 3rd. She had started arriving at the maintenance bay in the mornings slightly ahead of Nell, already pulling on her work apron and asking Walt what the first job was, somewhere around the 4th. She was, in every way that mattered, home. The wing had continued to develop through all of it. Dr. Fenn had adjusted the brace 3 times as the joint strengthened and the range of movement increased. Each adjustment meant slightly less support and slightly more freedom, which was the whole point. The brace was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to give the wing what it needed until the wing could give itself what it needed. By the 5th month, Dr. Fenn had said something that Nell wrote down on a small piece of paper and kept in her jacket pocket. He had said, "She is ready." The morning it happened, Nell told Scylla over breakfast. She said it plainly, the way she said everything. No ceremony, no build-up, just the fact sitting there on the table between them like a tool laid out for a job. "Dr. Fenn cleared you yesterday," Nell said. "Full flight attempt. When you are ready." Scylla was holding her cup in both hands. She went very still. "When I am ready," she repeated. "Your words," Nell said. "No pressure. No schedule." Scylla looked down at her cup. Then she looked at her left wing, the one that had trembled and folded for as long as she could remember, the one that had defined what she was told she could not do. She extended it slowly. It spread fully, clean and even, the membrane smooth and the joint steady. No trembling. No folding back. She looked at Nell. "Today," she said. Word moved through the maintenance bay the way it always moved, fast and without any formal announcement. By mid-morning, everyone on level 3 knew that Scylla was going to attempt her first real flight in the station atrium, and by late morning several workers from level 2 had also found reasons to be in the area. The station atrium was the largest open interior space on Varick's Crossing, 6 levels high, wide enough that a mid-sized transport could turn around in it on a slow day, used mostly for cargo movement but also, on quieter days, for absolutely nothing in particular. The maintenance bay on level 3 had wide upper doors that opened directly onto the atrium's third-level walkway, which meant the bay had one of the best views of the open space available. Someone propped those doors open at 11:30. Nobody admitted to doing it. It simply happened. Scylla stood on the upper service platform inside the bay doors, looking out into the atrium. The space opened up in front of her, 6 levels of clean air, the distant ceiling far above, the lower floors small and quiet below. Station light came through the ceiling panels in long steady lines and lit the space from above. She had been in the atrium hundreds of times. She had walked across its lower floor, crossed its upper walkways, looked up at its ceiling from below. She had never looked at it from a launch point before. It looked different from here. The workers in the bay behind her had gone quiet. Not the uncomfortable kind of quiet, the specific, focused kind that a group of people falls into when they are all watching the same thing and they understand that what is about to happen is real. Walt Kress was standing to the left with his arms folded and his expression set in its professional mode, which was fooling nobody. Greta Marsh was beside him with her welding hood pushed back on her head and her hands clasped. 3 level 2 workers who had no official reason to be present were standing near the back and not explaining themselves. Nell was standing 1 level below on the main bay floor, looking up at the platform. She had not given Scylla any last instructions. She had said everything she needed to say over the past 5 months. In the daily brace exercises, in the evenings working through wing extension drills in the quarters, in the long careful conversations with Dr. Fenn about load angles and flex tolerance and what the wing could bear. There was nothing left to say. Scylla knew everything she needed to know. So Nell just stood and looked up and waited. Scylla looked down at her from the platform. Their eyes met. Nell gave her one nod. Slow and steady the way she did everything. Scylla turned back to the atrium. She breathed in. She counted to 10 the way Nell had taught her, slowly, letting each number land before moving to the next one. She felt her shoulders come down. She felt the wing settle. Then she stepped off the platform and jumped. The first 2 wing beats were rough. The right wing caught the air cleanly but the left came in at a slightly low angle and for one single breathless second she dropped faster than expected. A stomach-dropping fall of maybe 4 feet before the left wing found its position and the brace joint flexed and held and she leveled out. She leveled out. The next beat was stronger. The one after that stronger still. She rose, slowly, not in the sweeping powerful way of a full-grown Drakari, but steadily and really and completely under her own power, up past the 3rd level walkway, up past the 4th, the air moving under her wings and the ceiling getting closer and the whole enormous atrium opening around her like something she had been waiting her whole life to enter. She banked left near the top, a wide careful turn, her wingtips cutting the air in a long smooth arc. She leveled out again and began a slow descending glide back down through the center of the atrium, and the station lights caught her silver scales from above and she was, in that moment, the brightest thing in the room. In the maintenance bay below, someone started clapping. Then everyone did. Not polite clapping. Real clapping, the kind that fills a space, the kind that has sound and force behind it. Walt Kress made a deep percussive sound that was the closest he had ever come in his professional life to a cheer. Greta Marsh was not attempting to look professional at all. The level 2 workers who had no reason to be there were making considerable noise for people who were officially absent. Scylla came in for her landing on the upper platform and touched down with 2 unsteady steps before she caught her balance. Her chest was heaving. Her wings were trembling slightly, not from weakness but from effort, the honest trembling of a body that has just done something new and real and hard. She stood on the platform and looked out at the atrium for a moment. Then she turned and looked at the bay full of people making noise on her behalf. She made a sound that no translation system on the station had a file for. It was small and it was fierce and it had years inside it. Every quiet morning in the shelter corner, every choosing day, every word that had ever told her this was not something she would do. It came out of her like something released, like pressure through a valve that has finally been opened, and it echoed off the atrium walls and came back to her changed, larger than it had gone out. Then her legs gave slightly with the emotion of it and she sat down on the edge of the platform. Nell was already on the stairs. She climbed them in about 4 steps and crossed the platform and put her arms around Scylla without saying a word. Scylla grabbed hold with both hands and pressed her face into Nell's shoulder and held on with everything she had. Nell held her back just as tightly and stared at the atrium ceiling over Scylla's head with bright eyes and said nothing at all for a long time. Behind them, the bay had not entirely stopped making noise. Walt Kress turned back to his workstation after a minute and picked up his diagnostic reader and looked at it without seeing it for several seconds before putting it back down. Greta Marsh wiped her face with the back of her hand and then looked at the welding hood in her other hand as if she was not sure how it had gotten there. Dr. Fenn's post-flight check that afternoon was thorough and unhurried. He checked the joint, the membrane, the muscle response, the brace fit. He made notes. He asked Scylla questions about what she had felt during each phase of the flight, and she answered all of them with the focused precision of someone who had been paying close attention to her own body in the air. When he was done, he said that the joint had performed exactly as designed and that he wanted to see her in 3 days for a follow-up, but that there was no cause for concern. Then he said, in the same careful clinical voice he used for everything, that in his medical opinion the brace could begin its final reduction phase. In approximately 6 more weeks, if the development continued at its current rate, she would not need it anymore. Scylla looked at the brace on her wing. She had worn it for 5 months. It had become so familiar that she sometimes forgot it was there. She thought about what it would feel like to fly without it. She looked at Dr. Fenn. 6 weeks, she said. Approximately, he said. She looked at Nell. Nell looked back at her with the same steady expression she always had, but her eyes said everything else. 6 weeks. The walk home took them through the lower residential corridors the long way, the route that passed the East Market and the cargo exchange and the community board where station notices were posted. Nell had suggested it without explanation and Scylla had not questioned it, falling into step beside her the way she always did now, easy and close, their pace matched without thinking about it. The station was busy at this hour. Workers coming off shift, traders moving between stalls, the general productive noise of a place that ran without stopping. People they knew nodded as they passed. A few said something about the flight. Word had moved fast as it always did. Scylla accepted the comments with a short nod and a small smile, which for her was a considerable amount of public warmth. They passed the East Market. They passed the cargo exchange. They turned into the lower residential stretch where the corridor widened and the foot traffic thinned. And then Nell slowed. She had not planned it. Or perhaps she had, in the way you plan things without admitting to yourself that you are planning them, by choosing a route that went past a certain place, by walking at a pace that would bring you there at a certain time of evening. The shelter was on the left. Its lights were on, warm and steady behind the observation window. The common room was visible through the glass, most of it empty at this hour, the day's activity wound down, the quiet settling in. But not entirely empty. Near the window, close enough that the glass fogged slightly with small breathing, a hatchling stood with both hands pressed flat against it. Small, brown-scaled, with wide eyes that were looking out at the corridor with the particular expression of someone watching a world they are not yet part of. The hatchling's eyes moved to Scylla first. They went to the silver scales, the repaired wing held at her side, the easy way she stood beside the human woman. There was something in that look, a long careful study, the kind that means a child is trying to understand if what they are seeing is real or just something that happens to other people. Then the hatchling's eyes moved to Nell. Nell had stopped walking. She was looking at the small face pressed against the glass with an expression that Scylla recognized. She had seen it once before, through a different window from the other side of the glass, on a day when she had not expected anyone to stop. Scylla looked at Nell. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Nell looked at her for a moment. Something passed between them, not words, just the quiet understanding of two people who have been through enough together that whole conversations can happen without any of them being spoken out loud. Nell turned to the shelter door. She pushed it open gently and looked at the young worker at the front desk inside. A new face, someone Scylla did not recognize, who looked up with mild surprise at the human woman in the doorway. "Is it all right if I come in?" Nell asked. Her voice was calm and easy and completely familiar. "Just to talk." The worker looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Scylla standing behind her in the corridor, at the silver scales and the repaired wing and the expression on the hatchling's face that was made entirely of knowing exactly what this moment was. The worker stood up and stepped aside. Nell walked in. Scylla stayed in the doorway for just a second, looking at the small brown-scaled hatchling who had turned away from the window and was now standing in the middle of the common room looking at them both with enormous careful eyes. Scylla knew that look. She had worn it herself. She knew exactly how heavy it was to carry and exactly how long it stayed with you and exactly what it felt like when someone walked through the door and sat down on the floor and did not treat you like something to be passed over. She went inside and let the door close behind her. In the warm quiet of the common room, Nell crossed to the middle of the floor and sat down, not on a chair, not at a distance, but on the floor, cross-legged, at the level of a small hatchling who had been standing at a window waiting for something she had almost stopped believing would come. She looked at the brown-scaled hatchling with the same calm, steady, unhurried attention she had given to a silver-scaled hatchling in this same room, in this same shelter, on a choosing day that had ended with an empty room and a whisper that was never meant to be heard. "What is your name?" she asked.